Alright guys, so this is the very last video of this tutorial. I'm going to finish up the compositing. Feel free to look at the description for all the specific parts that we're going to be going over. Otherwise, let's get started. So moving on now, I want to do the depth of field. Depth of field is the way that the camera is going to focus on different elements of the shot. If you have a really shallow depth of field, objects closer to the camera or further away, depending on where the focal point is, are going to become a lot more blurry. Now for aerial aviation photography, it's unlikely we'd see a shallow depth of field because the photographer or the cameraman is going to have the f-stop up pretty high. However, we can still add a little bit, and especially if we look later on in the shot, maybe around frame 150, it would make sense for this part of the plane to be the focal point, and the rest might begin to just get out of focus just ever so slightly. So in order to do depth of field properly in After Effects, it is a little bit tricky to do. There is a plugin that takes a lot of the hassle out of this, but there is a way to do it natively in After Effects. So before we do that, we're going to go down to this plane beauty shot. Just noticed this needs to be at the top, and we turn it off. We don't usually need this plane beauty, but we can just leave it there for reference later. If you remember, the plane beauty is simply what was rendered from the frame buffer with all of the passes already composited, so we don't actually need this one, so we'll just turn this off. Next, we're going to go into the plane depth. We're going to make a copy of it. Click Ctrl-Shift-C or right-click and do pre-compose. Move all attributes into the new composition. Double-click this layer. Right now we're looking at just the Z depth. Now this needs a bit more contrast on it, but right now we're going to add a background. And the background, we're going to sample the color of the wing at the back end of the plane and place this layer underneath. It kind of makes it look like the plane is coming through some fog here. This is fine. Now the reason we have to do this is because without this layer, the depth of field will stop wherever the plane stops, and that's not how real focusing would work, so we can't just single out separate objects. Otherwise, it's not going to look correct. Pop back over to plane 2, and we're going to add a new adjustment layer underneath and call this depth of field. And we'll be using 2 of these Z depth passes, so we're going to rename this one as well. We'll just call this DoF, or depth of field. So on the depth of field, we're going to grab a camera lens blur effect. Alright, so right away you'll notice that when we put on the camera lens blur effect, everything is coated in the same amount of blur. So to change that and actually use that depth of field map, we're going to go into the blur map, change the layer to be the plane Z depth DoF, and then we need to change this from source to effects and masks. So we can put curves effects on this Z depth layer, and then it will propagate those results through. Otherwise it will only look at the source. Alright, I'm going to zoom out here, and I'm going to crank this value up to be some ridiculous value, just so we can see this very clearly. Now right away you'll notice that the edges look a little bit odd, and that's because anything that's blurred up to the edge of a canvas, since there are no pixels outside of it, it's going to give this kind of effect. So repeat edge pixels attempts to fix that. Next, what we're going to do is select our plane Z depth DoF layer, turn it on so we can see what we're doing, and then add a curves effect to it. So we need to crush these black values quite a bit to really begin to see what we're doing. We want the front end of the plane to be black, and we do want to try to smooth out this transition. We don't want there to be a hard edge here. Turn this layer back off. And now you can see that this is currently in focus, this part right here. Go into the depth of field and change our blur focal distance. We'll just start increasing this slightly. And as we increase it, it's going to shift the position that's in focus. So we're looking for maybe a value of around 0.1 or maybe 0.05. So it's more or less in the center there. The rest looks absolutely ridiculous and not realistic at all, but this was just so we could figure out what part is in focus very clearly. Now we can drop the blur radius back down to something like 5, and this is going to look a lot more realistic. So this part is in focus. And then as we get further away from the plane, it gets a little bit softer, has more of a film look to it. So it is reasonable to expect that the edges might get a little bit more blurred. You can always lower this value if you want to, but this looks pretty good. Another thing that you'll notice is that the clouds look a lot better. So without the lens blur on, we get a lot of artifacting from the pretty low sampling time that we had in V-Ray. So by adding just a little bit of blur, we kind of get rid of a lot of that without having to do a higher sampling rate. Now we will go ahead and do that because there's areas around here which is still far too grainy, but for this large area of background, adding a little bit of blur goes a long way in clearing that up. I'm going to rename this effect to be my depth of field, DoF. I'm also going to add a second camera lens blur effect underneath this, and I'll put the value quite low at around 0.3. So it will coat the entire scene again in another layer of blur, but it's going to add just a tad amount of blur here. We might even lower that to 0.2, just so it's not so sharp when we re-render. We might also just lower this very slightly. If you want to do 4.5 or maybe 4, might look a little bit better now. Also, you need to check from different positions. The further we get away from this, the more out of focus it's going to appear by default. So if we wanted to here, if we go to the very end of the composition, you'll notice that the plane is much darker. So there's going to be far less blur at the front end of the plane. But at the beginning, the plane is quite bright. So to make this image look a little bit better, what we're going to have to do is go into the Z-depth layer, and you'll notice that the background blends in with the tail towards the end of the shot, but at the beginning is really not bright enough. So I'm going to add a curves effect to this light gray solid. At around frame 130, this appears to be pretty good, maybe 140. I'm going to set a keyframe on the curves, and I'm going to go to the very beginning. And at the very beginning, I'm just going to crush these white values up so they're a bit brighter. That kind of blends in a little bit better, because we want to make sure the background is always not really the focal point of this. It's always going to be the plane. Next, we can pop back out to the main composition, and you can see that now the plane is sticking out more. The nose is always darker than the background. Okay. So we can now turn this back off and then move on to the next part. Okay, so now that my renders have finished, I want to show you how we can easily import new files. So up here, we'll just start with exhaust. Right click on exhaust, go to replace footage with file. We're going to navigate to the version 3 folder, go to exhaust, and you can see that this is now being updated. Grab the plane, do the same thing. Right click, replace footage, file, go to the plane. See, the plane is now being updated. And then we're also going to do the sky as well. Okay, it's very, very simple to import new versions of files. And just scrub through this and just make sure everything looks pretty good. I like the wing being brighter there. I think that's going to be better. And I like seeing underneath the plane too. There's one last thing that we can do with Z-depth, and that's going to be atmospheric perspective. So atmospheric perspective is going to be if there is atmosphere or air between the viewer or the camera and the subject, the further that distance is, the more faded the subject is going to look, because there's more atmosphere in the way. So I could go into a whole lecture on this, but I'm going to just try to sum that up pretty quickly. And we're going to control this again with Z-depth. So we're going to leave Z-depth here, but what we're going to do next is turn off all of these passes except for GI. So we just want to keep one of these on so we can work at one at a time and then just copy and paste the effects as we go up. But we need to be able to see what we're doing just on one layer. So we're looking for an effect called the set matte effect. So the set matte effect is a way of being able to use a matte without having to put a track matte directly above the layer. Since we're going to be using this matte several times, it's much more convenient to use the set matte effect. We're going to be using the plain Z-depth layer. And then for this, we're again going to use effects and masks. And we're going to be looking at the luminance channel, so the bright values. So when you do that, you'll notice that the plane goes partially transparent. So if I were to solo this layer, toggle the transparency grid, you can see it's more faded at the front than the back, which is the opposite effect that we want. So we'll go into the invert matte, and now it's more faded at the back. So this might be a little bit too faded, but for right now, this is fine. We can go and correct this in a moment. But one thing that you will notice, the way this effect works, it is going to make the plane more faded. So we're going to fix that in a moment. But before we do that, we're just going to select this set matte effect, copy it. We can turn on these layers again, and then we're going to paste each one of these passes. We don't paste it on Z-depth. That is the matte. We don't need to add anything there. So this looks way too transparent right now. So let's go up into our plain Z-depth layer and add a curves effect. We'll turn this on so we can see it more clearly. The front end of the plane is going to need to be a lot darker. So actually what we're going to do here, we're going to take this, crush the black values, maybe do something more like this. For a plane this small, you're not going to notice a huge amount of difference from the front end to the back end, but if you had multiple planes in the shot, you would probably want to do this a lot more on the planes in the distance. But something like this will give us a really subtle effect, but it should work pretty well. So if we just look through different angles here, we should be able to get a good read of how this is going to react. So the further away the camera is, the more faded it should be. This is looking a little too faded though, so we are going to need to crush the black values a bit more and reduce the contrast. So right here, it is looking a little faded, but let's just go ahead and see what it looks like when it is composited. Let's turn this Z-depth layer off. So we can see that it's far too faded here, but we can fix that in a moment. What we need to do now though is fix the fact that we can see through the background. So to fix this, we're going to go down to our plain GI layer, just duplicate that and move the duplicate underneath, and then rename the duplicate to be plain matte. So let's solo this layer so we can look at it unobstructed. Let's solo this layer, toggle off our transparency grid. Instead of using the GI layer here, what we're going to use is the alpha. So for R, G, and B, we can just say alpha, 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 and then click OK. We do not need a set matte effect, so we can just delete it. And now we're just left with an outline of the plane. A faster alternative to this is to simply use a fill effect over whatever layer you have. You can just do something like this to color it in. That's perfectly fine. So it's either change the extractor to be alpha only or fill it in. Turn this layer off, and then next we're going to need a copy of our sky. We'll duplicate the sky and place the sky right underneath the plane map and rename this layer to be sky blurred. So the track matte on the sky blurred layer is going to be an alpha matte of the plane matte. Solo this, and you can see that the background is now showing up in an outline of the plane. So we need to blur the sky. So we'll add a fast box blur. And then for the blur radius, we'll do a value of around 50. We will repeat edge pixels. We shouldn't actually ever get to the edge, but just put it on, just always do it. Now we're only caring about averaged values here. So as the plane moves through the sky, it's going to blur these values. So if this is not blurred enough, maybe increase this to 100. Because we're looking more for the average value. Turn this back off. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and also we need to save this to a version 3 file since we are using new frames. So version 3. So to really see if this Z depth is doing anything, if we turn off the curves effect, we can see how faded it is without the curves. This looks pretty good. So we're getting slightly more fading at the back than we are at the front. This might be more evident at the beginning, which it is. We're quite a bit further away from the plane. This looks a little bit silly though. So what we're going to do to fix these frames at the beginning, we're going to grab another curves and we're going to animate these curves, turn this plane Z depth layer on. By frame 80, it looks like this part of the plane is pitch black. So we'll set a keyframe there. At the beginning, we need to crush in the black values a bit more, and then we'll lower these white values again. Something more like this. Click U so we can see the keyframes. I'll select this keyframe, click F9 to ease it out. Turn this layer back off. And this looks a little bit better. You can always go ahead and change these, but we do want to make sure that this is animated. Now, unfortunately with curves, it's very difficult to animate them between two keyframes. So if you did want to go ahead and reanimate this, you're going to have to go to a key position that you've keyframed, and then you can change them. All right, so this is beginning to look a lot better now. There's just a few more things that we need to do, and then I'm going to go ahead and add some bloom to this. So this next part, I want to look at the lights on the wings. So I'm going to take the self-illumination layer, solo this, and I'm going to add a glow effect. Add the glow, I'll lower the threshold, and then we're going to just lower the opacity down to about 75%, and I think that's going to look a little bit more subtle. Another thing I'm noticing at the beginning of the shot, the front of the plane is looking a little bit too blurred. And this is because in version 3 we pulled the camera out quite a lot, so the depth matte needs to be adjusted. So we're going to go ahead and fix that as well. So we're going to go back up to this plane Z depth comp, double click, and we animated a curves effect to try to match the background with the back of the plane. We're just going to tweak some of those values and make it blend a little bit more, especially here. And then at the very end, we'll add another keyframe, something more like that. And then we'll add another curves effect. And at around frame 70, I think this is looking pretty good. We turn this back on. We'll set a keyframe there. And at frame 1, we can barely see it anymore. So we're going to crush the black values here. So the nose of the plane will begin to appear. And we need that to be dark. So the dark area indicates what is in focus. So we can do something like that. And as soon as we go back, we can see that this is going to look a lot more in focus. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is just brighten up the background a little bit. We'll go to our sky layer, add a curves effect, and boost the values of the sky. And next we're going to add some bloom. Now bloom is going to be where the highlights glow. This is often seen in film or with photography where brighter objects have kind of a glow to them. Often it's overdone in games, but it does give a nice visual effect, and I'd like to add it to this plane. I'm going to try to find a better angle here towards the beginning of the shot. And we're going to just take a copy of the beauty pass, duplicate that, and just rename it to be bloom. Turn this layer on and then solo it. So it's possible to do in After Effects, which I'm going to show you here. It's also possible to do in V-Ray as well. So in V-Ray, you can add bloom by going into the frame buffer, selecting this icon down here, and enabling the bloom and glare effect. Now I have set these values to something that would make it show up. By default, it may not appear to do anything. The most important effects to get it to work are going to be increasing the intensity and lowering the threshold. You also probably want to turn off hardware acceleration because this often does cause problems, at least in the times that I've used it. And you can see around all the highlights of the plane, we're getting this glow. Now this can be saved out as a render element or a pass. So by selecting this, going up to your passes, you can select glare and you would get an effect like this. Now this is perfectly fine to go ahead and use this. However, I want to show you a way that we can do it in After Effects. So we have this copy of the beauty pass, and on this pass we're going to add a set matte effect. Now usually you don't use a set matte effect as the layer that it's on, but in this case it's okay. So we're just going to use itself. So we're using the same layer. I'm going to change it from alpha channel to luminance. I'm going to grab a curves effect, I'm going to crush the black values and then boost some of the midtones back up. Next we're going to add a glow effect. Now the standard glow effect does not have a realistic fall off. If I lower my threshold, increase the radius, it doesn't have a natural fall off. It just stays pretty consistent. There is an effect called Real Glow, which does a much better job of this. So if you can find this plugin, I'm not sure if it's available anymore, but it is a very good plugin. It handles glow and bloom in a much more realistic way. I'm sure there's other plugins as well. However, we're gonna work with this and get it to do what we need. I'm going to turn off the solo, and I'm going to set the mode to be screen. Now the difference between add and screen is that add will allow the addition of all the pixels on this layer and below to exceed 8-bit and enter high dynamic range, where screen clamps the values at 1. By using screen, you avoid clipping, at least from the layer that you're blending. So the layer itself is quite bright, but if we were to compare this with add, we can see clear amounts of clipping here. We're almost getting values of 2. By setting this back down to screen, we're not getting such harsh results. I am still going to use a HDR highlight compression effect, and I'm just going to leave that on at 100% for now. Alright, so I'm pretty pleased with that. I need to see this whole thing rendered out to really know for certain. But we only have 2 more things left to do, then we can go ahead and render out final frames of this, and after that, render out the composition. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to add some camera shake. We're going to go ahead and do that really fast. Go up to here, add a new null object. Now on the camera shake null object, we're going to add 2 slider effects. Click enter, and we're going to rename the first one frequency, and the second one is going to be intensity. Then we're going to duplicate both of these effects, and on the second one, we can just call it rotation. We're going to grab all of the layers underneath. We're not going to grab the color correction or the vignette or the camera shake itself. And then you can either use the pick whip and attach all of these layers to the camera shake layer, or you can go into the parent link option and just select it this way. Next, we're going to open up the position. So click P, hold down the Alt key and click the stopwatch for position. Then we're going to type in wiggle, open parentheses, then take the pick whip and attach the first parameter to the slider control of frequency. Do a comma, space, and then take the pick whip again and grab the slider control for intensity. So the wiggle effect takes 2 parameters. The first one is going to be frequency, so how many times per second the value can wiggle or just move around. And the second parameter is going to be how many pixels or how many units of whatever channel you're on can move. So in this case, we're using pixels because we're using a position transform. Then we can just click the numpad enter key. And for the frequency, we might try a value of around 2 and the intensity of around 10. And when we do this, you'll notice perhaps even more if you increase the intensity. So if we did something like 50, we'll notice that we're going to get a border. Depending on the size of your intensity, you will have to scale up this layer. So we're going to hold down the shift key and click S to open up the scale. And I'm going to increase the size of this null object by maybe 2%. You'll have to scrub through and just make sure that that is consistent. You might need to do a little bit more depending on what your intensity is. Next, we're going to hold down shift and click R. Then we're going to add an expression to the rotation channel. Again, we're going to be using wiggle. Then we can attach the first parameter to the frequency rotation, comma, then grab the intensity rotation. Then click the numpad enter key or just click off to the side. Now for rotation, we want to do something that's really, really subtle. So I'll actually do 0.5. So it's going to be every 2 seconds. And then for the intensity, we'll only do a maximum of 1 degree. And the reason we're using slider controls is so you can animate the camera shake. If you were just to use these numbers directly in the wiggle function, that's fine to do, but there's no easy way to animate those values. So if you put them in sliders, you can control the values at any point just with basic keyframing. So throughout the animation, this is just going to kind of wobble around, and with the rotation, we will need to scale this up just a little bit more. We're getting a little black edge there. To be safe, I'm just going to say 105. Now earlier, I mentioned that I needed to pull the camera out a little bit further because I knew that I was going to have to scale in. So always make sure that you don't have your subject touching the edges of the composition, so you can always crop a little bit of the plate. Okay, so I think that's going to look pretty good when we render it. Now with camera shake, we are actually moving all of these layers, and anytime you move anything in After Effects, you need to add motion blur. So we are going to select all of these layers, and then we need to select the motion blur switch, which is going to be this button here. So we just line it up, and then make sure that this switch is enabled for the comp. This allows motion blur to be enabled everywhere. I'm going to close that, and we have one final adjustment to make. I'm going to go into layer, new adjustment layer, and we're going to add some film grain. Grain needs to go underneath your color correction, and we're looking for an add grain effect. By default, you get this little preview window, so you need to change the viewing mode to be final output. And the default grain is quite hideous. So on the intensity, we need to change the intensity to something like 0.1, and then the size also down to something like 0.1. This is supposed to be a very, very subtle effect, but in areas where there's shadow, like in the intakes and in the cockpit, cameras will always have even a little bit of grain. And if everything in your plate is super clean, this is going to look a little bit unrealistic. So we're going to maybe drop that down to 0.05, and that looks a bit better. All right, so now the only thing that we have to do is render out a higher quality version of just the plane. So after adding the camera lens blur and adding the grain, I think the quality of the plate is fine, so we don't need to go ahead and render that out again. So we need to pop back over to Maya. I don't actually need to render bloom, so I'm going to turn that off. If you do render bloom, you can do it as a separate pass, and then you can choose to use it if you want to. I'm gonna close this down. I up version this to version 4. So we need to go into our render settings, do the same for our version label here, then go into the V-Ray tab and change the max render time up to 1 minute. Now this is going to be dependent on your PC's hardware, so 1 minute on a supercomputer is going to be very different to 1 minute on a laptop. It will be a lot better than just a 6-second render. So a full minute is going to produce a much cleaner image. We only need to render the plane layer that's selected. Everything else looks fine. And then we can go ahead and render this out. I made one slight error here. This plane bloom layer needs to be underneath our depth of field layer. Otherwise it's not going to blur in the same way. But now we can go ahead and load in plane version 4, place the footage with the new plane version. I'm going to up version our comp as well to version 4. And now we're ready to render the preview. Let's go over and rename our composition name, composition settings. This is now version 4. Whatever this is would be your file name. Then we're going to go up to composition, add to Adobe Media Encoder queue. This will launch the Media Encoder. It might take a few seconds, maybe even up to a minute to transfer this, depending on the speed of your PC and if you have used the encoder before. So if this doesn't load up right away, don't panic. Next, we're going to click on H.264. And again, this process can take several seconds. Here you can change the format to something else, but we're going to leave that on H.264. We're going to leave the output name the same. All of these basic video settings, these are going to be taken from the After Effects composition. So if something is incorrect here, you need to go back to After Effects, fix it there, and then send it back over. We are going to render at maximum depth, and for the bitrate, we are going to use variable bitrate, or VBR 1 pass. There's not a huge amount of size difference between 1 pass and 2 pass, but a 2 pass does take twice as long. So on the target bitrate, we're going to say 20, and then for the maximum, we're going to say 25. If you're rendering in 4K, you would probably need to boost this. The target should be around 40, and maybe the maximum around 50, but for 1080, this is fine. Then we're going to use the maximum render quality as well. Click OK, and then click the green start button. Then I'll come and show you the final result. Here's the preview rendered out, and this would be appropriate to send off for a client review. I also have an alternate version of this that I did a few years ago. So you got the wingman in there, got a different HDR, and a slightly different animation. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. If you made it through all the videos, I really appreciate it. The series took a lot of time and effort to put together, so I hope you guys think it's worthwhile, or at least you learned something that you didn't before. Alright, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.